Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Maselli, a media officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Thank you for joining us this morning for a webinar for the recently released report, Compounded Topical Pain Creams, Review of Select Ingredients for Safety, Effectiveness, and Use. You can download the report and related resources at nationalacademies.org/compounded pain cream. And on that same page, we'll also be posting the slides and recording of this webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, we are private nonprofit institutions that provide independent, objective analysis and advice to the U.S. to solve complex problems and inform public policy decisions related to science, technology, and medicine. For each requested study, panel members are chosen for their expertise and experience and serve pro bono to carry out the study's statement of task. The reports that result from the study represent the consensus view of the committee and must undergo external peer review before they are released, as did this report. I have with me several members of the committee to discuss the report, but before I introduce them, just a few reminders. This webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour. We'll start with the presentation summarizing the report by committee members, and then we'll open it up to your questions. You can simply click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to submit your question. And if you have any technical issues during this webinar, you can call Zoom technical support at 1-888-799-9666 and select option 2. And with that, I'd like to introduce the members of the committee that wrote the report who are here with us today. We have 3 presenters. Deborah Schwinn, who chaired the committee that wrote the report, who is currently president of Palm Beach Atlantic University and formerly a professor at the University of Iowa. We have Carol Wood, who is a research staff scientist at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and Edmund Elger, director of the Z Pharmaceutical Experiment Station at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Pharmacy. We'll also have 3 additional committee members who will be present during the Q&A portion of this webinar, and they are Barbara Inslee Crouch, the recently retired executive director of the Utah Poison Control Center, John Farrar, associate professor of epidemiology and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and Joyce Suchi, a board certified toxicologist and principal scientist with Exponent. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Schwinn.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Schwinn, and as Stephanie just said, I served as chair of the committee authoring this report. Next slide, please. First of all, we would like to formally recognize the sponsor of this report, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, for their interest and support. Next slide, please. To form this committee, the Academies conducted a formal committee nomination, including a process where all proposed consensus study committees are reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine leadership to ensure there is appropriate expertise, balance, diversity, and avoidance of conflict of interest. It was a pleasure serving as committee chair for this study, and I am grateful for each member's contributions. Next slide, please. We'll begin the presentation by providing a quick overview of the study's statement of task and provide a brief description of the committee's research approach. We will follow with review of the report's key messages and recommendations, and then we will open the floor to address any questions or comments you may have. Next slide, please. This is the FDA's charge to the committee, which I will now read. An ad hoc committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine will conduct a study of the ingredients used in compounded topical pain creams. The committee will identify and analyze the available scientific data relating to the ingredients used in compounded topical pain creams and evaluate how that data translates to the safety and effectiveness of compounded topical pain creams with various combinations of these ingredients. Based on this assessment, the committee will develop a report that summarizes its findings, including addressing the following specific items. First, identify the ingredients that the available scientific data suggest may not be safe and/or effective to treat pain topically. Second, describe the concentrations and combinations of ingredients that may raise significant study issues. And third, comment on the level of benefit expected for the various ingredients given their likelihood of absorption through the skin. Based on these findings, the report will offer recommendations regarding the treatment of patients with compounded topical pain creams. Next slide, please. Between March 2019 and February 2020, the committee held 6 meetings. These meetings provided an opportunity for the committee to privately discuss its research, as well as ultimately write and edit drafts of the report. In addition to these closed session meetings, public information gathering sessions were held to gather additional testimony and data to inform the committee's charge. Participants in these supplemental information gathering processes included a range of subject matter experts, including compounding pharmacists, clinicians, researchers, policy experts, and officials representing various stakeholder organizations. Members of the general public were invited to provide comments at all public meetings. Next slide, please. In addition to the evidence collected at its public meetings, the committee also conducted reviews of peer-reviewed scientific literature and the gray literature. The latter is defined as research reports, online publications, or books for a lay audience on topics relevant to the study's statement of task. We also examined resources submitted from relevant stakeholders. These included survey data from the American Chronic Pain Association on consumer use, oral testimony on the clinical need for topical pain creams in palliative care, literature reviews from the Professional Compounding Centers of America, or PCCA, on the safety, effectiveness, and use, survey data from PCCA on the quality, safety, and median costs, data from the FDA on reported adverse events, data from the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy related to the common formulations and use, and data from the American Association of Poison Control Centers on adverse events. The committee used all gathered evidence to formulate findings, conclusions, and actionable recommendations. Next slide, please. Now for our study background, next slide, please. I'm going to give you a little bit of background because it's important to recognize that pain management is complex. Pain is often difficult to treat, and the increasingly aging and diversifying American population is bringing some of the limits of current pain management therapies to the forefront. Specifically, complexity of pain management may increase for special populations for whom commercially available FDA-approved oral pain medications may be unsuitable, intolerable, or inadequate for a variety of reasons. As such, there are a number of proposed advantages for the use of FDA-approved topical pain creams, and these include selective delivery of drugs to peripheral sites of action, improved tolerability owing to less contact with the gastrointestinal system, ability to combine multiple drugs with different mechanisms of actions at varying dosages to meet individual patient needs, or a desire to have less systemic absorption, fewer side effects, lower abuse potential, and greater convenience compared to oral pain medications. More recently, compounded topical pain creams have become more popular as patients and providers look for additional pain treatment options outside of those FDA approved for use. Next slide, please. In general, compounded medications serve as therapeutic alternatives for people with clinical needs that are not met by commercially available forms of FDA-approved products. Due in part to the history of as a small-scale, patient-specific, and ad hoc practice, compounded medications are not subject to the same level of extensive testing and stringent regulatory oversight as commercially available FDA-approved products. In addition, at the state level, oversight of compounding is limited and varies widely from state to state. Given that recent decades have seen an emergence of a type of compounding that is not patient-specific, as well as greater volumes of compounded drugs sold across state lines, the potential patient population receiving compounded topical pain creams has widened. Next slide, please. This schematic compares select steps within the statutory and regulatory processes for FDA-approved drug products versus compounded drug preparations. The figure is intended to provide a general overview of statutory and regulatory processes and does not offer a complete summary of the complex regulatory framework for all drugs or compounded preparations. However, one major takeaway from the figure is that the FDA does not approve compounded medications. In addition, the compounding process does not require explicit assessments to prove basic safety and efficacy of the medications. Finally, adverse event reporting is not required of 503A compounding pharmacies. Those pharmacies that produce compounded preparations upon receipt of a valid patient-specific prescription or in limited quantities in anticipation of future prescriptions. Next slide, please. While the FDA provides some regulations for compounding preparations, state pharmacy boards retain primary responsibility for the regulation and oversight of 503A compounding pharmacies. Importantly, the frequency and content of State Board of Pharmacy inspections vary greatly by state. As an example, using data collected from the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, or NABP, sources, as well as certain state-specific regulations, the committee compiled two figures to demonstrate variability in state requirements for 503A compounding pharmacy compliance with USP chapters 795 and 797 standards for non-sterile and sterile compounding, respectively. The current figure outlines the variability in the 795 compliance. Next slide, please. This figure outlines the variability in 797 compliance. Next slide, please. Based on data described within chapters 4, 5, and 7 of the report, the committee highlighted several areas of concern regarding safety and effectiveness of compounded preparations in general, and for compounded topical pain creams in particular. Areas of concern include the following. First, the rate and extent of a drug's absorption into the skin and beyond is often unknown. Secondly, no clear clinical rationale for specific combinations of active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, and the dosages used. And third, inadequate labeling requirements for compounded preparations, and this includes no detailed description of the formulation, including all APIs and excipient components, no clear guidance for use, including how much, for example, cream surface area and volume, and under which conditions to apply, and no caution for potential adverse effects. And as a result, healthcare providers and patients may not be aware of all potential interactions or side effects of the components in a given topical pain cream. Limited and variable oversight of the development of compounded preparations, documented cases of harm and in some cases death of patients using compounded topical pain creams, most commonly used to misuse of medicine. And of note, even though only a few case reports of serious adverse events were found, the lack of information does not demonstrate overall safety. and they may also not be aware of, particularly for compounded pharmacies for which a prescription is prescribed, the 503A compounding pharmacies, non-standardized surveillance procedures and protocols for ensuring appropriate reporting of adverse events. Next slide, please. In addition to safety concerns, the committee found concerns with measures of effectiveness as well. These include there is little to no publicly available information on the various formulations and compounding protocols used by different compounding pharmacists or compounding physicians. There are little to no justifications available for formulations, individual ingredients dose in those formulations, whether enhancers are used and why. There is little to no publicly available information on mechanisms of action of multiple APIs in a single formulation and with inactive elements of the compounded product. And there are few well-designed studies of formulation effectiveness. Next slide, please. With this context in mind, the committee will now turn to the main focus of the study's charge, assessment of safety and effectiveness of ingredients used in compounded topical pain creams. Dr. Carol Wood will present this section. Next slide, please. Dr. Wood.
Thank you, Dr. Schwinn. At the committee's first information gathering meeting, the FDA presented a sizable list of active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs, of potential relevance to the committee's charge. Within this list, the FDA had highlighted 10 high priority APIs. And after deliberation within the committee, we decided to review all 10 of those high priority APIs. To support comprehensiveness across potential payment mechanisms, the committee expanded the scope of drugs to study by including an additional 10 ingredients that are commonly used in compounded topical pain creams. It's notable that there were many other APIs that could have been selected for this study, and it's important to remember that the omission of a category or a mechanism of action does not imply safety or effectiveness or potential usefulness of drugs in that category used in compounded topical pain creams. Next slide, please. Among the 10 APIs identified by FDA included 3 muscle relaxants, an opioid agonist, an NMDA receptor antagonist, an alpha-2 adrenergic receptor agonist, 2 anti-epileptics, an NSAID, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, and an antidepressant. Next slide, please. So in addition, the committee identified 3 anesthetics, 1 anti-epileptic that acted by a different mechanism, another NSAID that did act by a different mechanism. With the rise of CBD, we chose to look at cannabidiol. We chose a steroid, a calcium channel antagonist, another antidepressant that worked by a different mechanism than the one on the FDA list, and a phosphodiesterase inhibitor. Next slide, please. The scope of the research report was limited to accommodate the study's available resources and timeline. Specifically, the study does not focus on design, effectiveness, or safety of systems designed intentionally to achieve systemic levels of medications, like a topical drug delivery patch that's intended for systemic absorption. Instead, we focused on all preparations and products that are intended for application to intact, healthy skin. So by definition, that omits and excludes mucous membranes or external body cavities, such as the mouth, nose, rectum, or vagina. Even though there is a substantial body of literature that looks at the use of compounded topical medications in those other clinical circumstances. Let me say a brief definitions of the terms effectiveness versus efficacy. The current research study has a charge to evaluate the effectiveness rather than the efficacy of compounded topical pain creams. While similar, the terms are not synonymous. Efficacy refers to the therapeutic effect of a treatment under controlled conditions, while effectiveness refers to the therapeutic effect in the real world, such as situations in which certain contextual measures, like the placebo effect, may not be strictly controlled, and broad outcome measures, such as health-related quality of life, are considered. Effectiveness data alone may not be sufficient to inform conclusions regarding a treatment's therapeutic effect. For the purposes of this report, the committee evaluated all relevant data produced by randomized controlled trials, non-randomized clinical studies, case reports, and where applicable, preclinical studies to help address the study's charge. As a result, many of the research findings discussed throughout the report assess outcomes related to the potential effectiveness or efficacy of compounded topical pain creams. Given its broader application to the body of research reviewed, the term effectiveness is used more generally across the report. Let me also take a moment to define the term cream as used in the report. Cream designates any semi-solid preparation like a cream, ointment, gel, or lotion, typically with a soft and spreadable consistency that is intended for external application to the skin. Next slide, please. The committee conducted a literature search to identify any publications on the 20 selected APIs as they were applied topically. We found over 9,000 studies, which were narrowed based on research questions and scope parameters. Over 160 articles were identified as relevant to the committee's task and were reviewed by subsets of committee members and then discussed by the whole group. 2 systematic reviews in all studies with a comparator group, and this is studies such as randomized controlled trials, cohorts, and case control studies, were reviewed for findings on the safety and effectiveness of APIs when applied topically to treat pain on intact, healthy skin. For ingredients lacking that level of evidence, we turn to case reports, case series, or preclinical studies where relevant. For all randomized controlled trials identified as relevant to the committee's charge, we used the 2019 Cochrane Risk of Bias Assessment Tool. And Chapter 6 of the report offers a more detailed description of the committee's literature review efforts. Next slide, please. In summary, 22 randomized controlled trials reviewed individual APIs and compounded topical pain creams. Those individual APIs, which of course may have had more than one RCT, included clonidine, ketamine, naproxen, amitriptyline, doxepin, and pentoxifillin. Of these, using the 2019 Cochrane Risk of Bias tool, 7 had a high risk of bias, 13 had a low risk of bias, and 2 were noted as having some concerns. 11 randomized controlled trials studied multiple ingredients in the compounded topical pain creams, and these included a 2-drug combination, clonidine and pentoxifillin, and another 2-drug combination, amitriptyline and ketamine. We found 3-drug combinations, piroxicam, lidocaine, and cyclobenzaprine hydrochloride, and this is known as the PLC cream. Also found a 3-drug combination of baclofen, amitriptyline, and ketamine. We found another randomized controlled trial with more than 3-drug combinations, and I know some trials had up to 7 drugs in the cream studied. So of these 11 RCTs with multiple ingredients, 7 had a high risk of bias, 3 had a low risk of bias, and 1 was noted as having some concerns. And of course, there were other randomized controlled trials in the literature, but those were determined to be outside the scope of the committee's charge. Next slide, please. Of the 3 APIs identified, doxepin, which is a tricyclic antidepressant, lidocaine, which is a local anesthetic, those alone, individual in the cream, show potential evidence of effectiveness. Naproxen, an NSAID, alone has inconsistent evidence but demonstrated potential effectiveness to treat certain types of pain. A high dose of pentoxifil and clonidine combination, which are a vasodilator and a nerve receptor agonist, respectively, has limited evidence of effectiveness in one pain model, possibly due to systemic absorption of its APIs, but additional studies are needed for that. The 3 APIs, it's of note that those 3 APIs individually with evidence of potential effectiveness in compounded topical creams are already available in FDA-approved medications. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide, please. Data were inadequate to conclusively support conclusions regarding safety and risks related to the use of any compounded topical pain cream. Importantly, the absence of data does not prove safety or indicate that adverse events have not occurred. This is a particular concern where there's evidence of systemic absorption. High levels of systemic absorption of certain APIs in topical pain creams have occurred, potentially enabled by excipient selection. Also, indiscriminate use over large skin areas or use on non-intact skin can have potential life-threatening consequences due to excessive absorption. While the literature review process found only a few cases of serious side effects, the lack of information does not demonstrate overall safety. And because absorption could happen at the local, which is skin level, or regional, which is like deep into a muscle or joint or tissue, or systemic, which means full body, a substantial amount of high-quality research is still needed to identify effectiveness as well as relative risk for adverse effects in response to absorption of compounded topical pain creams. Next slide, please. In addition to conclusions derived from the literature search, as highlighted in the previous slides, the committee noted additional areas of concern related to the safety and effectiveness of compounded topical pain creams. These included inadequate federal and state level regulation and oversight, lack of data collection and surveillance, an inadequate level of training and education of healthcare providers and individuals who compound. Next slide, please. From these research findings, the committee came to 3 overarching conclusions regarding safety, effectiveness, and regulation of compounded topical pain creams. The first 2 are on this slide, the third is on the next slide. The first overarching conclusion is that there is limited evidence to support the use of compounded topical pain creams to treat pain conditions in the general adult population. The few APIs that show potential effectiveness in compounded topical pain creams, such as doxepin, lidocaine, and NSAIDs, similar to naproxen, are already available in FDA-approved topical products used to treat pain. The second conclusion, in context of recent rise in supply and demand of compounded preparations, lack of evidence regarding systemic absorption of ingredients used in compounded topical pain creams gives rise to a substantial public health concern. It is important to consider the potential effects and safety of all compounds, including APIs and the excipients that may permeate skin. It's important to reiterate that absence of efficacy and effectiveness data and with limited controls over the compounding process, the biggest concern is safety. Next slide, please. And the committee's final conclusion is that there is an opportunity for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to provide additional oversight to ensure the safety of compounded pain creams with prioritized focus on those containing APIs that, when applied topically, cross the skin barrier to enter the bloodstream and act systemically within the body. Next slide, please. So based on these conclusions, Dr. Ed Elder will now present the committee's 4 recommendations regarding treatment and addressing public health concerns surrounding compounded topical pain creams. Dr. Elder.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. Our first recommendation is related to treatment. Recommendation 1 is that the prescribing clinicians, compounding pharmacists, and other healthcare professionals who compound topical pain cream preparations should exercise caution when considering inclusion of compounded topical pain creams in pain management plans, given the lack of scientific evidence to support their safety or effectiveness beyond a few limited ingredients. Next slide, please. The remaining 3 recommendations relate to addressing public health concerns. Next slide. Pain researchers, public and private funding agencies, and relevant patient advocacy organizations should prioritize research efforts to examine the safety and effectiveness of compounded topical pain creams, including but not limited to randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials with sufficient numbers of patients to study, both in isolation and in combination, the active ingredients and inactive ingredients commonly used in compounded topical pain cream formulations. Second, the clinical research on active ingredients with demonstrated effectiveness to treat pain in preclinical animal models, which may indicate a potential therapeutic effect in humans, and in particular CBD or cannabidiol. Obtaining high quality evidence to inform the safety profile for all active ingredients used in topical pain creams that act systemically, and research on potential new topical or transdermal therapeutic agents to treat pain. Within the report, the committee identifies key funding agencies and patient advocacy organizations that could help drive these efforts. Next slide. Our third recommendation is that state boards of pharmacy, schools of pharmacy, and nonprofit professional societies and organizations within the medical and pharmaceutical sectors should support and incentivize more in-depth training on compounding delivered by schools of medicine and pharmacy. These courses should first review the compounding process, including the complexities of formulation science, which aim to ensure that all formulations are optimized when multiple active ingredients are combined. Second, examine current peer-reviewed, evidence-based conclusions on the safety and effectiveness of commonly used active ingredients and excipients in topical applications. And third, review the potential risks and reported adverse effects associated with the use of compounded topical pain creams. Additional continuing medical education courses hosted by for-profit organizations should not substitute for this more in-depth training owing to potential conflicts of interest. Next slide. Our fourth recommendation is that the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy should convene the state boards of pharmacy to unify and increase their oversight of 503A compounding pharmacies. The charge to increase oversight should also require all 503A compounding pharmacies to accomplish the following. First, provide a standardized insert for all dispensed compounded topical pain cream preparations with 1, a detailed description of the formulation, including all active ingredients and excipient components. 2, provide clear guidance for use, including how much, that is the quantity of cream applied and the surface area covered, and under which conditions to apply the cream. And 3, to caution for potential adverse effects. The second point is that the 503A compounding pharmacy should report adverse events to the state boards of pharmacy as well as the FDA through an established mechanism such as the FDA Adverse Events Reporting System, FAERS, or MedWatch. Third, that the 503A compounding pharmacy should monitor, record, and annually report the types, formulations, payers, and dispensing rates of compounded topical pain cream preparations. And fourth, that the state boards of pharmacy should uniformly adopt standards in USP 795 to ensure the quality of dispensed non-sterile compounded preparations. Our recommendation continues on the next slide, that the FDA and global standards setting organizations, that is the USP, should collaboratively develop standard processes for testing active ingredients, both individually and in combinations, as well as excipients commonly used in compounded topical pain creams. These testing standards should include protocols to examine the mechanisms by which active ingredients are absorbed and released from the compounded preparations, with a prioritized focus on active ingredients in formulations with transdermal properties that allow drugs to travel through the skin to act regionally or systemically. Next slide. So to summarize our key messages and recommendations, one, in the absence of well-designed, high-quality studies on the efficacy of active ingredients in compounded topical pain creams, there is a public health concern for potential harms. Second, the current data on safety and risks are inadequate. And third, the compounded topical pain creams should be prescribed and dispensed with utmost caution. Next slide. So today we're issuing this report, and it's publicly available on the website as indicated there. There will also be other dissemination activities, including social media and future seminars and conferences. Next slide, please. So again, we'd like to thank the FDA for sponsoring the study covered by this report, and thank you, the audience today, for your interest and attention. And I'll now turn it over to Stephanie Miceli, the media officer, again, for the Q&A portion of the presentation.
Thank you all very much, our committee members. And yes, I would like to open it up to our Q&A. And when you submit a question, if you will, please identify yourself and your organization. So just to kick things off for our panelists, what should patients and consumers be taking away from this report?
So this is John Farrer. I think the primary issue is to understand that while the committee took to heart the need for additional therapies for patients who have pain that will extend beyond medicines that are taken orally, that caution needs to be taken in the use of topically applied compounded agents because of the potential for the problem in the current setting is that we don't have adequate data to know about the safety or efficacy. And so while stories that are published about people who are successful in using them may be of interest, they do not indicate whether the drug will be safe or potentially efficacious for other people.
Thank you. Our next question regarding recommendation number 3, are there specific organizations that you're targeting for advancing education and training for providers and prescribers?
Yes, so this is Ed Elder again. So some of the patient advocacy organizations that may be able to provide funding would include the U.S. Pain Foundation, the American Chronic Pain Association, the American Academy of Pain Medicine, the American Academy of Pain Management Nursing, American Academy of Palliative Care and Medicine, American Cancer Society, as well as the Oncology Nursing Society.
Thank you. The next question is, did the committee collect any data about how many of these prescriptions are dispensed annually? And if so, what is the extent of use of these compounded products in the US?
Deb or Lee, would you like to address that?
Go ahead, Lee.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the committee did a number of exercises to gather data on types and numbers regarding the scope of compounding market. And the number was mixed. The numbers were mixed and it wasn't clear. We have a chapter in the report. If you look at chapter 2, 3, and I believe 7 of the report, we discuss how unclear the data are.
Thank you. Another question is, did the committee make safety comparisons between topical dose forms and systemic oral narcotics?
So this is Deborah Schwinn. We looked at the scientific literature, and in some cases, we were able to make comparisons for whether a drug was given through a topical compounded pain cream or even an FDA-approved topical cream versus an oral version. But the scope of looking at how this compares with opioids was not within the scope of the study, so that was not done.
Thank you. The next question is there a state that has best practices for oversight of compounding pharmacies? And if not, what are the report's recommendations for encouraging more coordination?
So this is Barbara Crouch. We recognize that there are states that are in full compliance with the standards for non-sterile compounding, USP 795, but that we also recognize that within those states, there may still be pharmacies that have different practices. What the report did call for is for the National Association of Boards in Pharmacy and a standard setting organization such as the United States Pharmacopoeia to convene states to uniformly adopt standards to ensure the quality of all compounded preparations.
Thank you. Another question is, in the adverse event reports, were there any deaths? And if so, was there a link between drug and dose as causative of the death?
So this is Barbara Crouch. I can't remember all the specific case reports, but there were several case reports with very significant toxicity where there were corroborating biologic samples, serum concentrations of a particular drug that was likely responsible for the adverse effects.
And then as a follow-up to that, on the note of data and surveillance, how should adverse effects associated with these preparations be tracked in a more systematic way?
Sure, this is Barbara Crouch again. We do call for in the report and encourage pharmacists to report adverse events to the FDA, as well as to MedWatch program and to the state boards of pharmacy. But more importantly, we also encourage pharmacists to provide adequate information to patients about the particular ingredients in their compounded product, both active and inactive ingredients, how to use the product, and then importantly, encouraging them to report any adverse events, not only to the pharmacist, but also to the FDA's MedWatch program.
Thank you. The next question, what types of evidence gaps did you uncover, and what types of studies will be needed in the future to help solve for that?
So this is John Farrer. The biggest evidence gap was the lack of almost any evidence about the efficacy of these drugs in a long-term or even short-term use. Compounded products, salves, skin creams have been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years to treat various ailments, and certainly have been used in the United States in a very broad way. The issue becomes more relevant when we think about the use of drugs that have been approved for oral administration with known active components and the potential for a difference in effect by using them as a topical cream. As was indicated in the report, there are very clear studies on 3 products, and there's a fourth as well that has been approved by the FDA with adequate data to demonstrate efficacy and safety. But beyond that, there is really almost no data, and that is really what is driving this. So the gap is that ideally the studies that would be done would be randomized trials, but even long-term observational studies of people using certain creams would add to the safety understanding of those creams.
We have another question about why wasn't the scope of the study set to include a comparison of opioid-based oral treatment versus topical? This is a major consideration for providers treating pain. And then also, can you comment on how providers can balance the safety concerns associated with compounded preparations, the desire to avoid opioids and explore alternative treatment methods?
So this is John Farrer again. I think a key feature of reports that are produced by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine is that we respond to specific charges. And so the charge was provided to us by the FDA, and we have provided the report in response to that. But in terms of thinking about the relative benefits of topical versus oral administration of any medication, including opioids, it's important to remember that just because something is being applied on the skin does not necessarily make it safer. The report does not say that there is a high risk of the use of specific creams, but we are saying very clearly that we don't have the data to rule out significant side effects from some of these treatments in certain people. When thinking about this with regards to opioids, there's a large amount of data about the use of opioids and many, many trials that have been done. And the absence of information in the compounded topical cream simply makes it impossible for us to make any valid comparisons between those two.
This is Joyce Suji. The committee was also concerned that the perception might be that topical creams are safer because maybe less systemic absorption occurs, but without clear data and good data to really evaluate that, that's difficult to assess. The other problem is patients or doctors might think that it's okay to use it on larger surface areas than actually prescribed or recommended. And that could result in a lot more systemic absorption or to compromise skin or even in other people in the household or to children or infants. So those were other safety concerns the committee had, which are detailed in the report.
Thank you. Our next question is, most of the active pharmaceutical ingredients used in these dosage forms are being used as off-label. What kind of education is needed for physicians who are prescribing these off-label uses?
So this is John Farrer again. Currently, physicians undergo a rigorous training in medical science, but because there is an expanding world of medical science, the exposure to every aspect of medical care is by requirement somewhat limited. That said, there is almost no, if any, education in a medical setting of how to think about and use topical therapeutics. One of the reasons for that is the lack of adequate information on the use of those particular compounded therapies, but it clearly makes sense for physicians and other healthcare providers to gain some training in these aspects of medical care. And I would ask Ed perhaps to talk about the education in the pharmacy programs.
Yeah, I think from that perspective, certainly the training in pharmacy programs has moved more towards the clinical end of practice and away from the basic sciences. And there's still a few schools out there that are doing training in compounding, but it's becoming more and more limited. And the emphasis is not just on the active ingredients, but also the inactive ingredients and what impact are those going to have on promoting absorption. There was a lot of information out there of animal studies looking at enhanced absorption of many of these compounds, but no tie to what does that mean clinically from a safety and efficacy perspective. So there's a lot more training that needs to go on. What can you do both positively and negatively to influence the use of these compounds from a pharmacy perspective and the compounder's perspective.
Thank you. We have another question. Can you specify what you mean by use caution as related to the use of these compounded preparations? What specifically should prescribers and patients do?
Well, this is Joyce Suji. This is a difficult area because the science is not very clear on the safety and the efficacy and whether the number of APIs that are being compounded are really necessary, and of course, what potential interactions might be involved. At a minimum, I think the report recommends that very clear information be given to patients and prescribers be very clear about counseling patients on how to use the preparation, that it should not be used in anybody. It should be to the patient, to the location, not on larger areas. But we do see this is an area which more oversight would be helpful to ensure that, and more research as well, so that better recommendations can be made about how these preparations should be used or whether certain combinations should be used.
Thank you, Joyce. Our next question is, if there is a lack of well-designed randomized controlled trials for compounded pain creams, then a compounding pharmacy cannot make a claim about safety or efficacy of the cream being dispensed. Therefore, what information does the committee want to see included in the patient insert?
So this is John Farrer. To start that conversation, the purpose of a compounded agent is to apply the specific active ingredient to the location of the pain or the problem, with the assumption that some of it will be absorbed into the skin and or surrounding tissues and perhaps have a direct effect. One of the big concerns about safety, though, is the absorption into the systemic system. And frankly, in any topical cream, providing information about the potential side effects of the active ingredient if it's absorbed would be something that would be worth considering. And the report discusses that specific aspect. But the other aspect of it is with regards to what was said by before by members of the committee, is simply to be pointing out that there are certain specific characteristics that the patients may wish to be careful about, and that there are safety concerns about any medication that's used, and any side effects should be reported to their pharmacist and or physician.
Thank you. And I recognize we're coming up at the 12 o'clock hour, so we do have time for just one more question. And that would be, which of your recommendations could be implemented immediately versus which will be more of a longer term effort?
Deb, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, thank you, John. You know, I think that probably what is the most important is that when patients receive a product, that they know what it is, that they know what's in it, and that they know potential complications and exactly how to apply it. So I would go back to our labeling as being something that even in a rudimentary form, before we have a standardized labeling system, that would be important to implement as soon as possible. Anyone else have other comments? Okay, Stephanie, is that, are we at our time?
Yes, we are. And I apologize if we didn't have time to get to everyone's question. We had a few hundred people join today's webinar. Again, I'd like to thank our committee members and thank our attendees for joining us. A final reminder, once you exit this webinar, you will be redirected to our report page. Again, that's nationalacademies.org/compounded pain cream. And with that, thank you all again for joining us.